All right, welcome to Sci Philipod for the weekend of February 12th. I, as always, am your host, Dr. Professor, PhD, Benjamin Weingard, very credentialed assistant professor at Hillsdale
I
College.
should know as an unemployed professor that I am indeed Weingard, PhD.
Yes, that's the
So
only
I also have
credential you
some
can claim.
credentials. Yeah.
Still in an undisclosed location.
I'll note that I'm right on the border of West Virginia, which will be germane for later conversation.
Yes, I am on the pretty close to the Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio borders, which will not be germane, but is an interesting
Die
factoid.
hard Midwest,
That's
though.
right. So today what we're going to do is we're going to discuss the impeachment trial that's occurring in the Senate, which should get wrapped up actually later today, probably.
Yep.
And then we're going to discuss Romney's plan, his plan, child allowance plan, um, and some of the back and forth that has resulted from that, including some blue check mark mobbing of Scott Winship, who was a conservative critic of the plan.
Yes.
And then we will conclude with our article of the week, which is by Emily Badger, and it is on West Virginia. And we'll use that as a lens to focus more broadly on so-called spatial inequality, and then also how that plays into politics. So let's start with the impeachment. What is happening there?
Yeah, so this is day what, 4? So this is the
It
the
is.
Trump defense. So we had day 1, which was sort of the opening statement, and then 2 and 3 going over the evidence. So I'll say on day 1, we had effective presentations from the Democratic prosecution, especially from Jamie Raskin from Maryland. So I think he was clearly the most effective.
Who's the leader of the
Right.
impeachment manager at the House?
Yes, the
Yeah.
head of it. So his presentation was poignant, effective. They showed a 13-minute video of the riot at the start of it, cut with Trump's talks, and I don't remember if they had tweets in that particular video, but that was effective. The Trump defense, which was led by a meandering, folksy presentation by Bruce Castor, was incredibly incompetent. And then Schoen followed him and gave the more angry, sort of what you would expect from the Trump fiery defense. But I would say the argument on that day clearly favored the prosecution, and the argument was, is this even a constitutional proceeding? That is, can you have a trial? So this is important because people say, can you impeach somebody who's not in office? But that's not the correct question, because Trump was impeached while he was in office. So the question is, can you try a president after they leave office? And I think clearly the originalist, textualist position is that yes, you can. And I think
there's historical precedent for this,
which Bruce Castor amazingly said, like, who cares what the English people were doing? That's why we had a revolution.
Yeah, and who cares about the Belknap case? Doesn't matter.
Which is so at any rate, so the prosecution makes the argument that textualism leads to the conclusion that you can indeed try and convict somebody who's not in office.
So that's on February 9th. They have this, and then they have a procedural vote to see if does this go forward.
Right. And so the procedural vote is 56 to 44.
Right.
which is one more vote than you had the first time they had this vote. So Bill Cassidy from Louisiana switched his vote. He was the only
Yes.
one who did.
That's right. So
And
he changed his mind.
Right, he changed his mind, said like clearly the prosecution here made really good arguments, and it was a focused presentation, and the defense was who knows what. It was, it was meandering. It didn't focus on the actual topic, which it didn't.
Mhm.
But let's stop there just to note. So I think clearly the evidence is that you can try and convict a president who is no longer, or a person who is no longer in office. And Chuck Cooper at the Wall Street Journal, he made the argument that, okay, like you remove the impeachment, first you remove the president, and then you would make a decision about, do we bar him from holding office later? So of course you can bar him after he's out of office, because that's what happens when you convict for impeachment.
Right.
So that was his argument. So I think the argument there, and the thing that's shameful about what the GOP is doing, and I know they've just struck upon this as a way to avoid having to defend Trump's behavior post-election while also avoiding convicting him, right? So they see this as the path between Scylla and Charybdis, right? We can sail through this.
Yes.
The problem is it undermines their claims of fidelity to textualism, originalism in the Constitution, which might be why Ted Cruz did come out and say, actually, you probably can do this, but I just don't like the case is just weak, right?
Yeah. So you had the Cruz response was, yeah, it's probably the case that you can impeach, but the prosecution, their argument that this constitutes high crimes and misdemeanors is weak. It was a horrific criminal attack carried out by violent thugs, but the idea that Trump was responsible for it is not there. Now, you also had the more, I would say, extreme kind of pro-Trumpy narrative from a few senators, especially Lindsey Graham, that this was pre-planned. The more we learn about it, the more that we know that the events of January 6th were planned well in advance. And he went so far as to say on Fox News, here's what I want to know. What did Nancy Pelosi know? And when did she know it?
Right. So, yeah. So that's the, who knows what.
Yeah. So you appear to have like three kind of responses. The real hardcore Trumpers who are doing all of this whataboutism, and Pelosi had to have known. Then you have the Cruz response, which is, yeah, you can impeach, but we're not there yet. And then you have probably the more threading the needle approach that you noted, the kind of Marco Rubio. Yeah, this was terrible. However, I don't think it's appropriate to impeach a president who's no longer in office.
Yes, and I just think that's a really bad argument, and I think it's clearly a bad argument. I mean, there is some debate about this. Turley, for example, argues that you can't. There's some serious scholarly debate, but I would say the overwhelming consensus is that you can. Historical precedent supports the idea that you can. And in fact, the text also supports the idea that you can. And so this is just an embarrassing sort of abdication of the typical Republican position of being, stalwarts defending originalism and textualism. Yes. On the other hand, I will say, what I really don't like, and we can get into days 2 and 3, we won't go in like so much detail about the arguments because the arguments actually end up not mattering so much, obviously.
Correct. It's just public relations.
Right. What I really don't like is that the Democrats decided to make this incredibly partisan instead of pushing the best case that they could to actually secure a conviction. Now, I know one retort is they were never going to get the conviction, so that's fine. Let's set that aside, though. think about what they could have done. So what they did is they picked a lot of very partisan people, and by partisan I mean people who just play tribal politics, like
Yes.
Eric Swalwell
and Ted Lieu
and Joaquin Castro. I was going to say Phoenix. Castro.
Yes.
People who are hated.
Not Julian Castro.
Oh yeah, Julian Castro.
Yeah.
People who are hated by Republicans because they're so tribal.
Yes.
And they set them out there to make the case instead of getting much more bipartisan people, or even getting people who were sympathetic to Republicans, or maybe former Republicans, or maybe current Republicans who aren't in office or something. I mean, you could have tried to make the case in a way that would directly appeal to Republicans, in a way that would really try to give them an excuse to come over. But they didn't. Instead, they made it more partisan, and they prosecuted the case in such a way that it was almost designed to make it uncomfortable for Republicans to vote for conviction. Now, I think they did that on purpose because they actually want Republicans to vote for acquittal, and then they can use this in 2022. And that's the cynical reading, but I think that it's actually the political reading as well. Now, that doesn't mean...
I slightly disagree. I don't think they want Republicans to vote for acquittal. I think they know that it doesn't matter at all. So what you might as well do is turn this into public relations and go big and present a poignant narrative of Trump after the election through January 6th that turns the public off.
Right, but you could, I think you could do that. You could still do that if you did it like my preferred way, which would be this much more targeted approach, much less partisan. You could still, in fact, you would have to, you would try to make the case that Trump's inflammatory rhetoric is what led to this, but you would make it in a way that would appeal to Republicans. Like you wouldn't, so for example, you wouldn't go before the election either. I think that's just partisan. There's no need to do that. I would go only after it. I would make the case, make it poignant, because that, focus on the police officers and how heroic they were and how much of a violation this was of this sacred building.
Right.
But don't do it in such a partisan way. I think, I imagine that there have been conversations that are similar to this. We're not going to get the conviction. Let's make this as partisan and uncomfortable as possible. Probably don't say partisan, but whatever. Make it as uncomfortable as possible. And when they vote for acquittal, we're going to use that in 2022 and 2024.
I think you have more individual conflicts of interest. I don't think this is a necessarily a broader strategy. So I think Raskin is doing more of your strategy, right?
Yes, he is.
I think then you have ambitious young Democrats who want to grandstand and help themselves for 2024, 2028. And then there's the question of like, well, how much control does Pelosi have over the Democrat strategy?
Right. There is that challenge, but you could imagine this complete. I mean, it would put a lot of pressure on Republicans in a sort of theoretical sense if you made this much more bipartisan and sold it to the public like that. Now you might lose some political gain.
Why do that when you can just cut effective campaign ads?
Right, exactly. But you are also right, is that there are people, there's the individual conflict within the Democratic Party that these individuals want to do this to get attention and
especially like a Julian Castro can get a big boost from effectively smearing not just Trump, but all of the Republicans who supported Trump.
Right. So at any rate, I just as somebody who thinks Trump should be convicted, I would have liked to see a more bipartisan kind of proposal, one that really would have put the screws down on an intellectually honest Republican. And we didn't get that. And in fact, a lot of day two, day three, it was, I mean, some of it was effective, but some of it was poking Republicans in the eye, because if you're going to go before the election and you're going to look at the rhetoric, you're basically saying you guys supported this.
Right.
And you're making it harder for them to vote for conviction, because in some sense they're voting against themselves.
Yes, and I think they're doing that deliberately.
So do
because
I.
right. So you're in a difficult situation as a Democrat, because it is the case, right, that the jury is not impartial here, right?
Yeah, of course, it's a political jury.
Not just a political jury, but a lot of these senators threw in with the big lie, right, and maculated their own lie. Yeah, right. Yeah. So they smeared their own reputation. So the Democratic calculation has to be, look, like these people, they're not going to actually vote for this. There's just zero probability. So why not make those individuals look bad and make it uncomfortable for them? That's an effective political move. And if if the Republicans were more open to impeachment, like sincerely open to it, I think you would have had more of a.
But what if you had from the beginning tried to make this something that both sides could agree on? Like, you, from the very start, you worked with Republicans to write the impeachment the way that would be the most effective. Now, I'm not saying that you could have got 17, but at least you could have struggled for it. It would have been somewhat realistic, I think. Now it's definitely not. There's no way you're going to get it. And at this point, it is more, I don't want to call it political theater, because that's not really fair, because there are serious issues that they're adjudicating, but it is more partisan. And with that, is obviously you're not going to get enough votes for conviction. In fact, I think you probably end up getting 55. I think you lose Cassidy.
Yeah, I don't think. Yeah, I agree. But why wouldn't you consider it political theater? The outcome is predetermined here.
Well, yes, it is. But
so sure, there are
one outcome is predetermined, right? The outcome that's at this point predetermined, or a fait accompli, is that he's going to be acquitted. Yes. But you're making the case not really so much to Republican senators now, but to the public. And there's something to that. I mean,
but don't you think that this is an incredible dereliction on the part? I mean, I take the criticisms of the way that the Democrats are proceeding with it, but it is an incredible dereliction on the part of Republicans, because I think we saw from the last impeachment that when Trump was acquitted, he used that as a propaganda victory. And I think this will be similar, right? Yeah. So he's been eerily quiet. I think he gets acquitted. He uses this as a propaganda victory. Then he just goes smearing the Democrats again. They tried to impeach me twice, plays on these grievances, and it becomes much more likely that he can run again than in 2024. And even if he doesn't, it certainly increases his hold over the Republican Party for the next 2 or 3 years.
An outcome which Democrats are eagerly hoping for.
Well, fine. Setting that to the side, though, it's not the Democrats' fault. The Republicans can do the right thing.
I agree with that. It is. I mean,
I agree. There are many Democrats who I'm sure are quite happy to have that outcome.
One reason this is such a dereliction of duty is because the Congress is falling over itself. The Senate, the Republican Senate, is falling over itself to give up power.
Yeah.
Right? So we
So do
have this
you?
adversarial system, and it's supposed to be, and often Republicans are the ones who will say this the most, that the real power in our system is supposed to be in the Congress. But here's the Congress saying, oh, no, 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 we don't have the power to do this,
Right.
even though the preponderance of the evidence and theoretical arguments clearly suggests they do have the power to do it.
So do you buy the kind of David French argument that some of the more savvy Republicans are just kind of punting this to other courts, like in Georgia? Maybe they will be able to punish Trump.
No, I think that they're not, they're afraid to vote for conviction because they think it will hurt them politically.
Right. Do you think let's say this, are they hopeful that Trump encounters legal trouble
Yes, yes.
so that they're rid of him, but they don't have to do the dirty work?
Even Hawley, who's the person whose biceps are the largest from carrying buckets of water for Trump for a long time now, even Hawley is eagerly awaiting the day that Trump is not viable. The problem is, it's like he can't cross the king right now. That's the
Yes,
problem. But
that's right.
I agree that it's absolutely disgraceful in that sense that they're voluntarily relinquishing power. And it's interesting because a lot of like the writers for the National Review, for example, or Jonah Goldberg has pointed this out, that even the term co-equal is misleading. You know, the Democrats will often say this is a co-equal branch. Actually, it's the superior branch in our system. Like quite clearly it was designed to be. So again, the fact that it would voluntarily give up power and say, oh, actually, we can't do this in the constitutional system, not even putting up a fight to be able to do it, is terrible. It's a terrible, it's a terrible signal of what the Congress is, which is a partisan battlefield, not a body that actually cares about its own prerogatives.
Yes, but that's also true of the executive and the judicial branches of government at this point.
No, I disagree with that. I think like
More,
if you
it's
look at the
more
judicial
true.
branch, they care about their reputation a lot, and they will sacrifice, they will avoid certain kinds of squabbles to maintain their status and power.
Yeah, agreed. Not right. They're not as abjectly giving up their power
Right,
to the prerogatives of a
right.
political party, but it's still more partisan.
Sure. And that's obviously like this is something you could have a 5-hour conversation about, because the founders clearly created a system that did not anticipate that the major division would actually be party and
Right.
not these bodies against each other fighting for power.
Right. So they anticipated that the Congress would jealously protect
Right, which is
their own
clearly
prerogatives.
clearly not the case. So
Yes.
I mean, I'm really not much need to go into day 2 and 3. There were a lot of videos. There were arguments about how Trump's rhetoric led up to this inexorably. I think the insurrection, I would just say, like, focusing on incitement, I think was a mistake. I agree with McCarthy here. They should have focused on the conspiracy mongering and the dereliction of duty more than the incitement.
Right. Right.
That's what I would have liked to see. But otherwise, look, at this point, what we've got here is it's a partisan attempt to hurt Republicans now. Republicans should do the right thing still, and they're not going to, and that's unfortunate.
Yes. Agreed. So I don't really have much to add to that. I just find this incredibly depressing, and
Yes,
it's not
I
even
agree.
really worth following because you know what's going to happen. It's utterly uninteresting.
I watched about 5 hours of it on and off on the first day, which I found a little more compelling because the argument was focused a little bit more, although obviously it strayed from this. It was focused a little more on this topic of could you do this constitutionally? The next two I didn't watch much of, although I did read the summaries of it. And yeah, it is. I agree. It is.
And it's especially sad because there are, I think, two facts that are relevant that have come to light since January 6th. One, that the people who participated in the January 6th insurrection were radicalized. The evidence suggests that they were directly radicalized by Trump and other Republican leaders and right-wing media, and that they hadn't previously been radicalized. There's the evidence presented by Robert Pape in The Atlantic on that. Right. And then secondly, that the actual insurrection itself, that there were a few instances where absolute disaster almost did happen, as with Mitt Romney came pretty close, and Chuck Schumer to actually encountering the mob, and we kind of have an idea of what would have happened.
Yeah, I do wonder what would the reaction look like if a senator or two were killed?
Yeah, I don't even want to contemplate that, because
I think it would change it. I think it would.
Yeah, I agree, but my God, it shouldn't have to get.
No, I agree. Far. It shouldn't have to. I mean, I just think if this is not impeachable, and if this is not, if you don't convict for this, right, you're almost not going to convict for anything. I mean, this is one of the most disgraceful displays of presidential behavior in the history of the country, and it's unambiguous. Now, what you'll get is some people claiming, well, there was fraud. What's Trump supposed to do? Retreat with his tail between his legs? No. If you think there's fraud, there are responsible ways to handle that. You say, I think that there's fraud. We're going to pursue these cases in the court. However, democracy is a sacred value that we're going to uphold. And once these cases are adjudicated, we will accept without qualification the winner, and we will concede if it's Biden. And if it's us, we will expect Biden to concede, and we will talk about it, because that's what democracy is about. That's not what he's done. He's clearly promulgated batshit crazy conspiracy theories. He's, forwarding belligerent rhetoric that has no respect for the norms of the country. And this should be a slam dunk. It should be 100 senators voting to convict him.
And they did pursue it in the courts.
Yes, they did 60 times.
Right. And they
won. Like the things that they won were like these very tiny procedural things that had nothing to do with the elaborate Baroque conspiracy claims.
That's right. So this is just an indication that negative polarization is out of control, and that we don't have transcendent political leaders at this point in our history.
Yes, that is the unfortunate thing, is just to think about like the kind of what it says about political leadership. And I say this on both sides. I don't find Lou or Swalwell particularly compelling as political leaders. There are a few exceptions. Ben Sasse, Mitt Romney. I'll even say Cotton, just because for the position that he's in, I think he handles himself pretty responsibly. Although, again, I do think he should vote to convict, although he's not going to. But anyway,
do you think he'll write another open letter to a foreign political leader when we're in intense negotiations with their country? I mean, that would be pretty statesmanlike.
You mean the Iran letter?
Yeah. I mean, you're writing this open letter to undermine.
Yeah, it's
quite an unprecedented move.
I haven't thought about that in a bit. I'd have to reflect.
Maybe he's matured since then.
At any rate,
but yes, I agree with you. So you do have a the Sasses and the Romneys of the world. But for the most part, we're bereft of real political leadership at a time where we need it. And it's unfortunate.
Yes.
Now,
And
I would say, I think Biden has been handling this quite well by just staying out of it.
Yeah, he's just completely stayed out of it.
Which
He's
is the
not
right
saying
thing to
anything.
do.
Yeah,
Just focus
exactly. It is.
on your American Rescue Plan and
Yep.
sit it out.
Agreed.
Okay, so we move on then.
Speaking of Romney and his great leadership, right?
Yes. Yeah, we move on to the Romney Family Security Act that he announced, and it was immediately applauded by wonks on both sides. Now there was some criticism and pushback, which we'll get into, but
Yes.
first I'll note on the left you had Matt Iglesias come out in support, strong support. He's quite excited about it. You had Matt Brunig, who was quite, he had some criticisms, but he was quite happy with it. And then on the right, you had Ross Douthat at the New York Times,
Yep.
Cameron Hilditch at the National Review, and then on the more libertarian end, Samuel Hammond at the Niskanen Center, who was quite positive.
And the Institute for Family Studies, as I'll talk about, also wrote up a positive piece on it.
Yeah. So before we get into the weeds of it, just in general, the liberal criticism to the extent.
Well, what's okay? So let's just say the main overview of the policy, right, is that it would be a payment to parents who have kids, period, right? It's a payment. It's not a tax credit.
That's right.
So it would be similar to a UBI in some sense for kids.
Yeah, you're basically paying families to have children, essentially.
Right. $350 per month per kid under 6. And we can get into the details, but that's the basic. Yeah. That's where you get some criticism and a lot of praise, right?
Yeah. So, and then to pay for it, and we'll get into the details momentarily, but to pay for it, Romney gets rid of a few programs that we have, consolidates others. So that leads to the main, I think, liberal concern is that there's no need to get rid of these other programs like TANF.
Let's do the conservative concern first, because that's more theoretical, and then and it seems to me the Democratic concern is more in the details. So the conservative complaint that you get from people like Rubio, who have been working to expand credits for children and trying to promote these pro-family policies,
EITC,
right, is that this is a step backward.
That's right.
Because it incentivizes people for not working, because you get it regardless. So that with the tax credit, you have to, I think you have to make at least $2,500 to get any of the child tax credit. Earned income tax credits, another thing that's really complicated in there. But Rubio's argument is this doesn't incentivize work, right? And that's the problem. And he wrote it.
Yeah, you get the income regardless of whether you're in the labor market or not. And in the technical literature, that's what's known as an income effect. So
yes.
I mean, obviously, in the extreme, if somebody pays me enough money, I am not going to work.
Right. So we can think if you're getting $5,000 checks a month, you're probably not going to seek out a job.
Right. So the empirical question is, how strong is the income effect, right? What's the elasticity there?
And another empirical question is, do we care so much if you lose some hours from women who are staying home and raising their kids and getting the money, right?
Right. That's right.
And so just philosophically, I would say I don't care that much if you lose some women from the labor force because they want to stay home and take care of kids. That to me is fine.
But to be clear, the Mike Lee, Marco Rubio, Scott Winship, Angela Ricciuti at the American Enterprise Institute, their concern is that the only real way to escape poverty
Right.
is to get into the labor market.
Right.
And therefore, and then you can start this kind of path of upward mobility.
Right.
So even if the disincentive effect is small, right, it can create a culture of poverty where working is no longer the cultural norm.
Right. It also can compound the problem because each year that you avoid the labor market is a year
Right.
that you're not picking up skills for the next year.
That's right.
I think if you have, however, if you have two-parent families and women aren't as active in the labor force, let's say it's a 2% decrease, but maybe men are a little more active or something, that would actually, to me, that would actually be good. I would actually prefer that state of affairs. But
Yeah.
I do get their point. But here's another thing, just empirically, is that the Romney plan doesn't have a steep phase out. So that is to say, it doesn't start, you don't lose the benefit if you make, say, 80,000 a year at a job. So
well, why don't we lay out the details of the Romney plan so this makes a little more sense. So the Romney plan, the weeds of it are you pay $350 per month, right?
You get paid.
What, 350 per month is paid out by the government to any to a family whenever you have your kid. And in fact, you can
actually starting third trimester.
Yeah, so you start to receive this payout 4 months before birth.
Right.
And then you get $250 per month when the child each
at
year
6 to 17.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so
the $15,000 total.
Yeah, so the maximum amount paid out per month per family is $1,250. The phase out, though, this is important. The phase out doesn't begin until $200,000 for a single filer and $400,000 for joint filers. Right. And the phase out, even when it begins, is not steep. So it's only $50 in benefits for every additional $1,000 of earnings. Another important administrative point. This goes through the Social Security Administration rather than the IRS. And we know that when you, like, for example, with Social Security, 97% of the benefits that are supposed to be paid out are paid out. Right. Whereas for the EITC, which goes through the IRS, only 78% are paid out. So the administration is much more efficient. Yeah. Basically, everybody who qualifies will get these payments, and the phase out is not punitive.
It's not steep, right?
Yeah, so it's not steep.
You're not really punishing work. So there's not this disincentive effect that you get with other forms of welfare, TANF, for example, or these other forms where
SNAP benefits.
Yeah, where you're actually punished for working more. And in fact, some people make a calculation. Also, you might be punished for getting married because you lose your benefits. So there are these various things that it's less of a, if it is a disincentive to work, and that's complicated because if you look at the UBI literature, there's some evidence that you get a reduction in labor hours from some groups, especially women who are taking care of children, for example. But there's not much of a labor market effect.
That's right. And so this is a substitution effect, right? Where the more you earn, the higher that tax is, the more money you're giving up. And that means the marginal utility of like each dollar you earn is lower, right? Because you're not actually keeping as much. So again, makes sense that if I'm giving up 60% of every dollar I earn, I'm probably thinking at that point, why am I working?
Right.
Yeah. And this avoids that, right? So
exactly.
you have the income effect, right? You're getting this money and maybe you will choose to drop out of the labor market or work fewer hours, but you're avoiding the substitution effect. That's the idea behind the design.
Right.
And importantly, before we get into the debate about it more, the Niskanen Center ran some modeling on it. And this is really important when you're thinking about the trade-offs here. They estimate that for children under 18 who are in poverty, that number will, under the Romney plan, would decline from 12% to about 8.4%. So a 32% reduction in child poverty. Even more impressively, though, for children who are in what's called deep poverty, that rate would drop from about 3.5 to 1.7%. So basically a 50% drop in the deep poverty rate from this Romney plan, right, which is quite impressive.
What I also, so there are two other things. One is that even if you're making a pretty decent living, this is sort of an encouragement to have children. It's like, you're not going to get punished by having to give up all your income for your children.
That's right.
That's good.
It has a pro-natal effect.
Right.
And that's why some social conservatives who care deeply about the family like it, because they like the idea of encouraging a higher fertility rate.
Yes, correct. So yeah.
We can also get into more in the back and forth there, but I just wanted to note that to pay for this, right, because Romney wants it to be deficit neutral. So to pay for it, he recommends doing the following: eliminating the SALT deduction, that is the state and local tax deduction, okay, eliminating the child and dependent care tax credit, eliminating head of household filing through the IRS. And then he wants to convert the EITC into a program where you just pay out a maximum benefit of $1,000 for single filers, $2,000 for joint filers. And then also importantly, because I saw some liberals who were critical of this, eliminate the temporary assistance for needy families program altogether.
Yeah.
Now, we can say just quickly, getting rid of the eliminating the SALT deduction is good, right?
It is good, but it's also something that blue state senators, representatives are going to be reluctant to do because their constituents obviously like that. Before getting to that, though, back to the other point, I was going to say two things. So one, this is pro-fertility. Two, by being more simple, it makes it more clear that people are getting the benefits that are supposed to get it. And that actually, I think, could create more of a norm of taking care of your shit, right? Because one of the problems now when you talk to, let's say, progressives who care deeply about poverty, and there's nothing wrong with that, if you point out things about welfare or whatever, it's not clear if people are getting the benefits that they could be getting. So you don't know who's getting them and who's getting left behind. Here, we know people would be getting them. So you can no longer make certain excuses about people not getting the benefits they could be getting. So that could have
so this is
a small contribution to a norm of, no, like we know you're getting this money. You can't just act as though you're not and then live a dissipated life, right?
Right. So this moves in the direction of creating a more transparent, streamlined welfare state,
right,
which has the benefits of, we have more information about who is getting benefits and how they're behaving when they get those benefits.
Right, which is why even libertarians are often attracted to UBI for this very reason, that you get rid of some of the bureaucratic inefficiencies and it makes the information more transparent.
That's right. Yeah. So just to step back to the SALT deduction quickly. So just to be clear about the state and local tax deduction. So this is when you pay state and local taxes, if you itemize your federal tax return, you can deduct those from the amount of taxes that you owe to the federal government. If you repeal the cap on that, right, that was put in place by the 2017 Trump tax bill that capped it at 10,000. So if you just brought the SALT back so everybody could use it before 2017's tax bill, 56% of those benefits go to the top 1%. right?
Yes. So it's
So
a
it is
very regressive tax.
Yeah, it's
deduction.
Right. It's an incredibly progressive tax to get rid of that deduction, right?
Right.
Yeah, so it's basically we're taxing only the highest income earners when we don't allow them to write that off.
Right.
So it's hard for me to see the argument for keeping it.
It's an argument that's made by people who are defending relatively wealthy people who live in New York and California, who are the biggest beneficiaries of it, clearly. So yeah, I agree with that. The TANF, you can debate about that, but the bigger, what are some of the more, I suppose, sophisticated criticism now with these details? So like, I don't think you have a lot of people defending SALT. Some people would defend some of these other policies. So for example, I think you have single parents lose a little bit from the earned income tax credit, right? And actually, this is something that the Institute for Family Studies likes because it's somewhat of an inducement to marriage, right? You're actually, under the system as it is, there are lots of ways you lose when you get married.
Right.
And they don't like that, of course, because they would like to see more marriages. So their argument is this is actually a pro-marriage plan because you lose some of that benefit and you're not hurt as much when you get married.
Right.
Progressives tend to be a little less, what would you say? They're a little less happy about that because they think first of all, they don't care as much about the mission of getting more marriages, right? And second, they think you're basically punishing single mothers because of some misplaced moral judgment.
Yeah, I think it would be fair to say that on the progressive left, there's a concern about being paternalistic in regards to how people behave, right?
I don't think there's I would clarify that though. I don't think they're concerned about paternalism per se. I think they're concerned about what they consider this antiquated sexual moral paternalism.
You mean trying to incentivize marriage?
Yes.
Yeah. It's same thing with trying to incentivize work, for example. A lot of progressives are opposed to that because I'm not actually sure. I mean, they view it as like it's punitive or you're forcing people to work these low wage, unpleasant jobs.
Yeah, or like, wouldn't you rather people sit at home and take up painting and do things that that they really enjoy and find satisfying?
Right.
There you get into arguments about how do people actually spend their free time if they don't have a job? Do we want people not to have jobs, etc.?
So in my view, if you zoom out a bit, you look at the big picture and set aside some of the technocratic wrangling, which of course is important. I'd like to see the welfare state move from this kind of bureaucratic, opaque system that empowers the kind of professional managerial class and leads to a lot of condescension and weird attitudes, to one that's much more transparent, streamlined, and consistent with, the kind of latest technology that we have available. And this is just, to me, a step in that direction. And if you are concerned about, like empowering social workers to control people's lives, this seems like a good step, right? Just give people money and then they get to do what they want with it. And
So it seems to me that a lot of the sort of what happens after you do this concern that I have is, what does this do to norms? Do you get norms? And let's just take this for UBI more broadly.
Yeah.
Do you develop more community related norms about, wait a second, we know these people are getting $1,000 a month. So if they're begging for food money, it's because they're squandering that somehow, and we should judge them. And that community norm that comes from the ground up in response to this would then guide behavior. Or does that not happen? And do you just get more people squandering it and still less judgment and then more like an equal amount of social worker condescension and paternalism because you have to? That's the question to me that's interesting.
Yeah, and I suspect that the answer would be both, right? That in some areas,
Yes,
you would enable more concentrated poverty and dysfunctional values, and in others, it would lead to more salubrious cultural norms and mores.
right.
I think if anybody claims that they know what the overall effect would be, they're lying. I mean, how would we know?
Right. We can look at UBI, and there have been a number of studies around the globe, and I included some of those in
Yeah,
the notes, but those are limited, targeted things, or weird examples like
right.
Alaska, where you get money from oil. We don't know what it would do to a,
Although
to a
it is
huge, diverse country.
that's right, but the Alaska Permanent Fund, right, is interesting. So in Alaska, they have this permanent oil fund, and they pay out a certain amount each year.
Mhm.
And there has been a lot of good research on that, including from this Marinescu, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, who looked at she did a synthetic control study with a co-author, and they looked at the employment to population ratio in Alaska
Mhm.
compared to comparable states. And
Mhm.
they didn't find that there was an overall effect. Now, again, the Alaska Permanent Fund, the highest payout annually was
Yeah, I was
$2,000.
going to say the benefit that you're getting is not very high, especially when you consider that the cost of living in Alaska is high.
Yeah, that's right. So whether that would hold if you were getting, 10 to 16, 17,000 per
Right.
year, it's hard to say.
Right. But the thing with the Romney plan though is it would be a more conservative experiment because it would be with kids.
Yep.
We know other countries have done this or very similar things, and we can look at what happens 5-10 years down the road. And it does seem as though most people think this would at minimum increase fertility, which for a population that's not even replacing itself is a good thing.
Yeah, and also I mean I think there's an moral ethical angle here. Like as a society, we through Social Security basically pay older people
Mhm.
a set amount. Now you can say, well, they earned that through
Right.
their
That's
work, fine,
right.
but they get a set amount of money per month that has basically ended poverty among the elderly.
Mhm.
Why shouldn't we give families a set amount for their children and try
Right.
to end child poverty, right? The children who are languishing in deep poverty, they didn't do anything to bring that on themselves, right?
Right.
So why punish them? Even if you want to morally condemn the mother or the father or the absent father, fine, I agree with that. But it's the children who are suffering, and as you can see from the Niskanen estimates, who would benefit, right? Who are the primary beneficiaries of this.
Well, I also think you can make the moral argument that, especially if you have women, I would prefer it be women for various reasons on average, but paying women, I mean, mothering's a hard job and it's an important job, and paying women for that seems perfectly reasonable to me.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
mean, morally, it seems like just recompense. Now, I think the concern would be, well, you get some incredibly irresponsible mothers who aren't even really doing anything and they're just taking the money and using it for other things. And that's where I think the community norms matter. And I, I mean, that's a whole different topic about what we should be, how we should be judging people, etc. But I would say generally don't let the worst examples deter you from a policy that would be good overall, and that would be fair and just. And I think this would be, and I think it would be, it's a conservative policy because it has pro-fertility effects, also probably pro-marriage, and it's not that radical. We can see what happens as we move forward, and I think we're going to move toward some kind of UBI. I just think that's like almost inevitable. And
Yeah.
this will be like one step along the way, and we can look at what happens, what went wrong, what went right, how can we tweak it, etc.
Yeah, I agree. And there are technocratic ways that you could put work requirements into some form of UBI or the Romney plan. Whether or not that happens, that's a separate issue, but you could do it. It's not like it's the administrative end of it wouldn't be that difficult. Also, interestingly, because we're going to get into the discussion about spatial inequality, one proposal that scholars such as Ed Glazer and Larry Summers have had is that you could have higher EITCs, or that is, like in this case, higher allowances in certain geographical locations to try to attract people to them, right? So I think anything that we can do to streamline the welfare system, to make it more transparent, and to, I don't want to say like maximizing individual freedom should be in and of itself a good, but often it is, to get people out of the kind of bureaucratic system that is often very dehumanizing, right?
Well, yeah, I think anything that focuses the behavioral coercion on community norms rather than like social workers and bureaucrats is a good thing. Now, obviously, it's an empirical question whether you would get that shift, because
well, you would get it on the administrative end.
Sure, but so like, to be clear, I don't think it's just that progressives want power and they want to manipulate things.
I agree.
There are real reasons you have social workers and various like requirements for these things, because there really is a lot of dysfunction that can result and people abuse it. So what you want is community norms that feel less coercive and paternalistic than these bureaucratic checkups. You have to go in and prove this or that or whatever it might be, right?
Well, there are also, and I'm cribbing this from Samuel Hammond, but I liked the way he phrased this in his discussion with Scott Winship over the Romney plan. The Roosevelt New Deal kind of philosophy behind the welfare state was make programs as universal as possible. Social security, healthcare, everybody can get into a union, and so on. The kind of Johnson, more bureaucratic, we're specifically targeting poverty per se, it leads to a lot of means testing, creating, more administrative bloat, and these kind of Byzantine bureaucracies that I do think that both progressives and conservatives should be opposed to.
So take a different example of a universal policy, education.
Yeah, good example.
So we could have an education system that says, look, like if you're making more than $80,000, you can pay for it, or you can pay more, you can send your kids to a different school. I mean, we do have the private option, of course, but public schooling is available for everybody.
That's right.
And the good thing about making something universal is it gets more broad buy-in. And then people accept this is just like a universal policy. So even if that means you're giving money to people who in some sense, quote unquote, don't need it, it's often worth it because you don't have more transaction costs, for one thing.
Right.
And you get more buy-in. So I agree. I think
that's right. I think it just tends to be popular. So if you have a program where you say, look, like any kid who graduates from high school with a B or above GPA, right, they get to attend community college for free.
Right.
That you just get a lot of buy-in. People like it. It's easy and efficient. The transaction costs are low. I like, from a philosophical kind of side, political philosophy, I like moving in that direction overall.
Yes, so do I, as much as you can. And I also like whatever would lead to more community norms and judgment regulating behavior. again, I'm not confident that this will do that, but if it will, that's a good thing.
Yes. So we move from the Romney plan, where I think we both are in agreement mostly on impeachment.
Well,
and
yeah, well, the other thing with the Romney plan, though, is it does illustrate a significant shift in the Republican. I mean, like, you could not imagine a Republican forwarding this plan in 2004, let's say. I don't think so, at least plausibly. It would not. It's just the Republican Party has definitely changed its thinking about dealing with poverty and other issues and become more, what would you say, more open to these kinds of ideas. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I think where you can see this is a real heterodox way of thinking is that, like, the post AFDC consensus among conservatives and Republicans was, if you give in-kind services to people, right, that is services that they don't need to work to get them, they're not cash. So Medicaid, SNAP, you can do that, but any kind of cash assistance, you have to work for that. And this cuts against that orthodoxy. So it's not surprising that you've had some pushback on it. But it is, again, I agree with you. Like, you couldn't imagine a Republican senator proposing this. And even, like, I think 2009, I don't think it would have happened.
Not realistically, I don't think. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's move from that then to the article of the week. West Virginia has everyone's attention. What does it really need? By Emily Badger, writing in the upshot at the New York Times. Now, why does West Virginia have everyone's attention?
Because Joe Manchin, who's the senator from West Virginia, is really important potential swing vote. So he has a lot of power in the Senate, because if Democrats want to pass something, even through reconciliation, they need to get his vote. What's interesting, it's just as a related point here, is that Robert Byrd, who was the previous senator from West Virginia, a Democrat who was in the Senate for like 50 some years, was actually like amazing at getting funding for West Virginia, including for the highway. So I was interested in, why are there so many highways through West Virginia, because I drive through West Virginia often, that are nice too, but are almost empty. And it's because of Robert Byrd. And there's an interesting biography of Robert Byrd called The Last Great Senator. I haven't read it, but if I had world enough and time, I would. But it's interesting how successful he was at this.
Yeah. So that also, that's kind of the old school Senate, right? Where powerful senators that could often be swing votes would vote with their party, provided that they were given some goodies. It's also the case, when I lived in Helena, there are a lot of Baucus buildings, right? And I'm like, what? And it's Max Baucus, he's a pretty conservative Democrat, so they'd have to give him some goodies to get him to vote for more liberal legislation.
Right. And maybe sometime we can talk about political realism and the sort of Jonathan Rauch argument there, which, because I'm pretty sympathetic to this kind of deal making, and if you can help your state get some money and some programs, then great. But that's a separate point.
The decline of earmarks.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So Joe Manchin's this important vote. So the idea is he's going to have a lot of power in the Senate to get things done for his state. And then the question is, how does he do that? What does West Virginia need? And then I guess to answer that, we have to answer, what's the problem with West Virginia?
Yes. So as with many rural regions in the United States, West Virginia is losing population. They have a relatively low level of overall educational attainment, right? They're aging. And they don't have a lot of high-tech infrastructure. So there's a real broadband deficit. Now, there are a lot of historical reasons for this. I think one thing that's particularly important in the history of West Virginia is that the mining interest in corporations were very powerful early on, and they organized before anyone kind of countered them. And they were able to avoid being taxed in the way that you have these, like the Alaska Permanent Fund.
Right.
And often these mining interests were out of state, like the companies were.
Right.
Right. So the wealth.
Yeah. So the argument from like pro West Virginia folk would be our wealth has essentially been stolen from us.
Yes.
And used to power the United States, and we haven't seen a return on that.
I don't think, I actually just think that's accurate, right? If you
well,
look at
so
it.
then it gets, there are debates about, well, how much was Byrd bringing back to West Virginia, and is that fair? And if you get into the investment, I tried to read into this, there's a lot of debate about it, but it is fair for West Virginians to say, we focused on this industry, this coal industry, and it provided a lot of power for the United States. And now that it didn't give us as much wealth as it should have. And now that we're transitioning to a sort of post, especially intensive fossil fuels, a fossil fuel economy, we're struggling.
Right.
And well, they are struggling because, yeah, losing population is
right. And but the other thing that happened though is that it sullied the environment, right?
Yes.
And West Virginia is naturally very beautiful. And
yes,
the other thing is, yes, Byrd was bringing a lot of money in for these large infrastructure projects that are helpful, but probably not optimally calibrated to the needs of local communities.
Yes,
right?
And I would just say, as somebody who drives through West Virginia a lot, it's an incredibly interesting state in which you see concentrations of white poverty, such as you'll not see elsewhere. I mean, it's just truly staggering, the communities that are utterly decimated. And I mean, clearly hemorrhaging population when you look at the census for each year, and just disgusting. I mean, disgusting in like a tragic way, though. I'm not morally judging here. Just like really, buildings that have been burned down and nobody's done anything to it. Just dilapidated, empty buildings everywhere. It's really tragic because it is a beautiful state.
Right. There is a lot of natural beauty. Now, another historical pattern is that, from about at least the New Deal through 1980, you had this process of regional convergence, right? Where relatively poor areas were catching up to relatively wealthy areas, probably because the cost of living is lower and the labor is cheaper. So that would entice corporations to move from high cost of living to low cost of living.
So you imagine
regions.
The dynamic there is like, say New York, the cost of living is really high in New York City or something. So people who want to start businesses and they need land or cap or whatever, they're like, I'm going to go to West Virginia where the cost of living is virtually zero, or Alabama or whatever. And so people would do that. It's a way for states to compete with other states, right? New York, you compete because you have so many businesses there. It's intellectual capital of the United States, probably. West Virginia, you compete because you're cheap.
Right. And you can see this. So if you look at, say, auto plants or auto parts manufacturers, you start to have them in the upper Midwest. They get unionized, cost of labor goes up. So they start opening up auto factories in the South. Right. Same thing with the textile mills. You start in the Northeast and then they start opening them up in the Southeast. Right. But something happened, right, starting in the 1980s that stopped this free market convergence from occurring. So what happened in the 1980s? What's going on now? Why are we seeing a regional divergence?
Right. So this is, just the general phenomenon. It's called spatial inequality, where if you look across the United States, certain areas are flourishing and other areas are languishing in poverty. And
Right.
just as there is inequality among individuals, so there's inequality among regions. And the question is, well, what's causing why did the convergence stop and then
Yes.
actually reverse?
Yeah. So what are some of the forces that have been identified?
Well, so one is economic agglomeration, right? The benefits that you get from just having a bunch of businesses next to each other. And that's interesting because you might think that wouldn't be such an issue when mobility is cheaper. It's cheaper to move. So a lot of people thought, and especially if you have internet and you can do things online, it's actually not as important to be next to the other people. So you don't need to be in New York City or in Los Angeles. But I think about that, and I just think about say the film industry. If you want to be an actor, it's still your best bet is move to Los Angeles. Like you could make a film, you could make a sort of, for some reason, I'm forgetting the term of, what's it called when you try out an acting?
Audition?
Yeah, you could make an audition tape and send it via the internet.
Right.
And that could do something, but it's still just so much better for your career to move to Los Angeles. So if you want to get into the film industry, you have to basically move to Los Angeles. Similarly, if you want to play different kinds of games, if you want to be in the game in different kind of industries, you just really need to be around the other industries. So you need to be in New York, or you need to be in Chicago, or you need to be in Atlanta, some of these Seattle, Portland, these big cities that are actually growing and the job market is growing.
Right.
So that's one thing.
Yeah, that economic agglomeration, I think, is a very important force, and there's a lot of research on it. So the idea that, look, like if I'm going to start, like think of Amazon and you're opening your new headquarters. If I am going to open up this Amazon HQ, and what's my primary need? My primary need is a lot of high IQ, highly educated workers. I can't just plop my headquarters anywhere and have that materialize. So I'm going to put it in the DC area or New York City area, or,
because think about putting this in, let's say you put it in, I don't know, some place in Georgia or whatever. Rural Georgia. You would have to pay for everybody to move. And also, it's not as desirable a location for people. So they're not as likely. I mean, if you can get a job in New York, a lot of people like that, or they're already there. It's hard to get high IQ people to move to some small rural place in Georgia or West Virginia.
Right. So you don't have the amenities that high IQ educated people like. You also don't have the same cultural norms and values that high IQ, hyper educated people tend to like. So for those and other reasons, you tend to see that very successful, high value added industries agglomerate. Then we also have the globalization that has had this huge effect, right? So in the 1940s and 1950s, let's say, if you had a large successful city experiencing an economic boom, that would benefit the surrounding hinterlands, because they would be like, say, with Chicago, you're taking steel from south of Chicago, and that helps Gary, Indiana out, right? Well, now, instead of taking your light manufacturing goods from the hinterlands, you're connected into a global supply chain. And as somebody noted, the hinterland for Silicon Valley is Shenzhen, China, right? That's where they're getting their manufactured products from.
Right.
And then furthermore, these like small town, exurban, rural areas, the high value added industries that they tend to have are highly mechanized and automated, such as like oil extraction, mining, and large scale agriculture. So you can have these high surplus value industries in a rural location, but they don't employ that many people. Like you think of large scale agriculture,
Right.
it's mostly just a automated tractor communicating with a satellite in space.
Right. So if you drive across Kansas and Iowa, it's like, yeah, there's a there's a lot of farmland there, but there aren't a lot of people employed making money from it.
Right. And one other, I think, important thing to note about this is that when you have a lot of high value added successful industries in a particular location, there are a lot of positive externalities. So individuals who are working in the non-tradable goods section or sectors, that is like mostly services, waiters and waitresses, people who do beauty salons, etc., they get paid better.
Yes.
Right. Because you have this thriving local economy. So it becomes
think
very
about
desirable.
all of the knockdown effects. So let's say you have highly educated, highly intelligent parents who move into this neighborhood. So let's say you have a lot of those people. Then let's say you're a Trader Joe's or something. So a lot of people are buying from you. Plus, you have access to really good, nice, kind, conscientious workers. It's like an amazing difference between going to these stores in certain areas and then in other areas where clearly they just don't have access to that labor and their store suffers from it. So there are just all of these kinds of effects that are downstream effects of this.
Right. And the end result of that is any young person with a modicum of talent wants to get the fuck out.
Right. So as they said in the article, there's somebody talking about West Virginia, the college, and just saying a lot of these people, a lot of the graduates, they like West Virginia in some sense, but they leave because the economic opportunities are very small, and also probably many of the values that they have and the amenities that they expect aren't to be found. So if you look at West Virginia, I think I've been to, there aren't really major cities in West Virginia. You have Charleston, which is the capital, and then is it Morgantown? That's I think where West Virginia is.
Yeah.
Which is decent. It has some of the amenities that you expect from a college town. But that's about it as far as that goes. And you can see it, these areas just aren't that attractive for 25 to 30-year-olds who are incredibly educated and expect these kinds of cultural amenities. They want to go to a theater and watch an indie film, or go to a sort of exotic restaurant or whatever, or find other intelligent people with whom to have abstruse conversations about Martin Heidegger or something.
Right. And so we have this real problem, this almost inextricable problem that scholars...
I don't think that's the exact right term there.
Hard to solve problem.
Inextricable means it's hard to... Insoluble problem, let's say.
Insoluble. What I was going to say, what's inextricable now is that you have the link between this problem and the political parties, right?
Yes.
Right.
So it's a value, it becomes this value problem that Charles Murray talked about in Coming Apart.
Right. Because what has happened for a whole slew of reasons is that the Republican Party now identifies, or I should rather say that rural white Americans and small town Americans are almost exclusively Republican voters, and urban Americans are almost exclusively Democratic voters. Now, how bad is this problem? Well, I want to know a couple of trends here so you can see how extreme this has become, right? So if you look at the 100 counties with the highest share of college degrees, in 1980, 76% of those voted Republican overall. Now, you might say, oh, well, that's just because, Reagan and he won, and 84 was an even bigger landslide. Well, even if you look at the year 2000, 49 of them went Republican. In 2020, only 16 did, right? So basically, 84 of the most highly educated counties in the United States voted for Biden. And you see the same pattern, interestingly, when you look at median income, which is interesting because historically the Democratic Party was perceived to be the party of the working class in the down and out. And that to some extent, with some complexities, is reversing.
Yes. And
So,
not surprisingly, West Virginia is a very, very pro-Trump state.
right. And so importantly, when you think about the things that the Democratic Party cares about policy-wise, such as affordable housing, improving the social safety net, increasing efficient transportation infrastructure for public transit, racial justice, increasing national research and development, helping workers in the service sectors. Okay. Those are all specifically tailored toward these diverse metropolitan areas that are thriving for the most part, right? And that's a real problem, because what happens when now we have this negative polarization and our political parties are tailoring their preferred policy solutions to just certain geographies within the United States?
I wonder if a fair assertion is that the Republican Party hasn't caught up to its base in some sense in policies that would be helpful in the long run. So the Republican Party, they are in sync with their base on cultural displays. They understand what their base kind of wants in the cultural domain. So they can go out and talk about woke obelisks and criticize excessive political correctness and praise guns and country music or whatever it might be. But they haven't quite really figured out the economic policies that would be good for their base, or that would work to keep together a coalition with their base and with donors. And that's a big problem, because what you want for West Virginia, there are things you could do to help these groups, but nobody's really doing that because the Democrats no longer appeal to those people. And understandably, they focus on people who vote for Democrats. Right.
And so while it's true that some of the Democratic economic policies would still help West Virginia more than perhaps standard Republican economic policymaking, they've completely alienated these voters with their cultural values and emphases, right?
Yeah, and that's really the interesting thing, because like, look, West Virginia used to be a Democratic state. Robert Byrd was a Democrat. Joe Manchin is a Democrat who's clinging to his position because he was the governor of West Virginia, and he was sort of this public state figure before the Democratic Party alienated West Virginia. And this is something that happened in a lot of these other areas. So it's like the Democratic Party has alienated these people via their cultural values.
Right.
But it does say, it's interesting, in the article, there were a couple of suggestions. So one was, now that some businesses will actually move to more online work, that could actually be a boon for West Virginia and other areas that offer cheap housing. Because if you don't have to, let's say you have a job in Philadelphia, or you work for a company in Philadelphia, but you don't have to be there, or maybe you only have to be there once a month. You can live in West Virginia, which isn't too far from it, but it's very cheap compared to Pennsylvania or say New Jersey, where the property taxes are just ridiculous. So you could, it's cheap housing, and you can still work and make more money at one of those places. That's one thing. And and the thing there is, you're bringing in money into your community that you'll likely spend in your community. So that's good.
Right. And so you can retain talented individuals who have graduated from, let's say, the University of West Virginia, right? They will stay put, and they can do some of their occupation can be done through Zoom or whatever, virtually. And so along with that also you can recommend two, I think, important policies that would help support that. One would be environmental cleanup, right? So you're trying to beautify
Yes.
West Virginia so that people find it more appealing, and you can attract more of these kind of hipster lifestyle liberals who
Right.
would enjoy the great out of doors, but don't want to drink toxic water when
Right.
they are so enjoying. And
Or
also
look at these these factories belching out billows of smoke, right?
Right.
I actually find it kind of aesthetically pleasing, but I don't know that I want to live right next to it.
Yeah, right. And then also a very practical concern is that you need more high-speed
Broadband,
internet,
right?
yeah, broadband access. And if you look at it overall, the share of residents without at least 25 Mbps in service, 27.4% of rural Americans lack that, compared to 0.6% who live in urban environments.
Yeah.
So that would be some provide a concrete
you,
investment
yeah,
opportunity.
you go into some of these areas in West Virginia, like it's again, it's like nothing I had seen before. When you drive through these roads into into the woods and mountains of West Virginia, you don't get any phone service for sure. And there are people who are probably just living off of the land. They have some cows and they have like chickens. And I mean, it's just like, it's a totally different, disconnected world. And yeah, I mean, if you have to, if your job requires you to do Zoom and your internet is incredibly slow and spotty, that's not good. So that would be something that you could do. That's like a pretty straightforward thing. Get more broadband.
Yeah.
Attract people. And then also they said like telemedicine, right?
Yeah, telehealth. Yeah, and that I was going to mention that another.
Yeah, I guess telehealth would be more.
Yeah, because another important factor to consider in a lot of these rural environments is that they don't have not just world-class healthcare or hospitals. They don't even have like up to average standard.
Yeah, I've seen
healthcare available.
Right, there's a hospital in Sisterville, which is on the river, which could be like this nice community, and they have a hospital there that I wouldn't go into unless I was 100% forced to, because you're getting, and I mean, you think about what kind of doctors are you getting in this area? Not to mention like just the underlying infrastructure is poor.
Yeah, that's right. And again, same experience in Montana, where people would tell me I would never give birth unless it's in Bozeman or Missoula, and that's it.
Right.
So you could imagine some potential here for creating better networks of hospitals that provide high standard care, which would help obviously the poorer residents, but would also help attract younger people who do care when they're going to have a kid, or if something should happen, they want to have high quality healthcare that's reasonably affordable.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be another opportunity. There's some creative thinking about expanding like community college networks, because a lot of these areas are also educational deserts.
Yeah.
Right. But one thing that I would say is that it's really important that we try to do something, even if we don't know exactly what works, because a lot of the fuel for populism comes from rural, small town and exurban areas where people feel like they're left behind. They're rightfully aggrieved. And you have this, this population that's pretty homogenous. They don't like diversity. They're not very educated. So they're susceptible to conspiracy mongering, right? And when that's the base of a political party, that political party's in trouble.
They don't believe the conspiracies of the left, systemic racism, pervasive misogyny, etc. They believe the bad conspiracies, which are the conspiracies of the right, which, yeah, some of them are obviously crazy and deserve to be denounced. But another important thing about populism is it is, to me, it's an understandable response to institutions that have been completely captured by radical progressivism. So if you could just imagine, like, if you had institutions that at least pretended to reflect some of the values and concerns of the average West Virginia citizen, populism would be the appeal of it, the luster would be significantly worn off, right? It wouldn't be as appealing of an alternative. And that's what bothers me, because yes, you do get obviously people who revel in the victimhood, right? And you can see this. I especially before the pandemic, I used to walk through these communities in West Virginia, and there's a lot of that Trump cut through the bullshit, fuck you, fuck everybody who hates us, like that kind of an attitude. And so you are, in some sense, hugging your victimhood. But it's also pretty understandable when it really is the case that there is an elite establishment that really do dislike you. They dislike pretty much everything about you. I mean, if you think about Hollywood and you think about that, you have like Carey Mulligan complaining because a reviewer mentioned certain features of her appearance, and that was turns into this scandal, and it's just like, oh my God, these people are so bigoted. And then you're somebody in West Virginia just thinking, who the fuck are these people and what the fuck are they complaining about? You know, I think that's, to me, I would put more of the blame for populism on the cultural ascendance of progressivism than I would on the failure of the Republican Party or both parties to grapple with the economic challenges here. Although I think they're important and we should grapple with them.
Well, it's not just the economic challenges that they failed to grapple with. It's the social, cultural, right, component that they failed to grapple with. I think if we were just talking about a relatively low standard of living, it wouldn't be as bad as having communities that are absolutely smashed to pieces and the social fabric breaks down and you have like 40% opioid addiction.
Oh, right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So there are, yes, agreed. So there are a lot of like signs of community decay and breakdown that are very distressing, depressing, and need to be dealt with.
And to be clear, I absolutely share your concern and the loathing of the way that mainstream institutions have been captured by woke progressive ideology. So we should do everything we can to push back against that. However, we need some very practical interventions or policy making that can help some of these communities, right?
Yeah, like agreed.
Raging against wokeism and supporting Trump's attempt to steal the election is not going to do anything about the fact that your unemployment rate is 15% and increasing.
Right, agreed. And especially it's not going to do anything that these communities are just absolutely depraved in some sense. I mean, and I'm not saying the individuals are bad people, but just like the behavior that becomes normal and that people just not only they just accept it, sometimes they even praise it because they get that sort of anti-establishment, fuck you, we're going to do this, you know, this kind of grasping to whatever you've got, that kind of behavior and encouraging that kind of behavior is obviously really bad.
Right. And you see, I mean, I saw a similar example of this with some of the Native American reservations in Montana, specifically in Browning, where there are dogs running all over the place that are not watched by anyone. The alcoholism rate is through the roof. It's just complete social dysfunction. And there are no, I mean, speaking of concerns about these cultural values around like work, there's nothing there. It's just, you get basically a barely a subsistence level amount of income through a variety of federal programs, and then live off that and drink a lot of alcohol and do drugs.
A very interesting thing that I've observed, by the way, which is a hypothesis one could forward, is that the less desirable the property, the more likely it is to have a stay the fuck off private property sign or something like that. And I mean, the amount of this that I see in some of these communities that I drive through in West Virginia is just truly remarkable. You know, or it would be like, never mind the dog, beware of owner, motherfucker.
Right,
You know?
right.
But yes, so it's a very anti-social, anti-country, because they become so bitter about the establishment and more broadly in the country. And so like,
Right.
you'll have an American flag, but then you'll have a Confederate flag, which I should remind people was a treasonous rebellion against the country,
Right.
which, if it had succeeded, would have created a nation state dedicated to the honorable practice, I'm saying that ironically, obviously, of slavery. I mean,
Right.
that's what that was. So it's just this weird, just very weird antisocial attitudes that sort of like,
Right. It really
they
does.
grow like pus in a wound there,
Yeah,
if you don't take care of it.
There's very dysfunctional subcultures that, as I said, they're extremely susceptible to a lot of dangerous anti-elitist rhetoric. And again, I'm not denying the fact that educated elites have bizarro beliefs that have real consequences. But when we're focusing on Montana or Wyoming or West Virginia, our solution can't be simply, I'm gonna fucking troll the libs.
Right. Well, this is why I think like a big problem here is that Republicans haven't caught up to their reality in some sense. So Tom Cotton knows that his voters will like it if he goes out and mocks the woke, or if he says, send in the military, motherfucker, we're putting these riots down. He knows people will like that. He doesn't know what kind of economic policies to forward, or what kind of careful conversation about the breakdown of community will appeal to people. And there are a lot of Republicans in that same ship, right?
Right.
So, some who probably earnestly do want to help and they're aware of these problems, but they just don't know the way to go about it that's politically viable.
Right. And I can understand some earnest concerns about the Romney plan or a UBI more generally, because you can see, okay, well, we basically have like a small scale UBI on a lot of these reservations. And look at what happens. It just enables you to have this dysfunctional culture of dependency into basically in perpetuity. The incentives are such that there's no reason
lulled to sleep in the government's hammock, as Ryan would put
it. Right. So clearly, a return to Ryanism and the Republican views of the 1990s is not going to be the way forward. But I understand some skepticism toward big government so-called solutions.
Yes.
And I understand the conservatives who go the route of, this is something that we have to deal with culturally, right? It has more to do with the decline in social capital and
the sort
churches.
of Ben Sass argument.
Right. But the problem is, well, sure, but what the fuck are you going to do about that? I'm not aware of any evidence-based way to increase church attendance.
Right. That's exactly like my thought on that. Is it's nice rhetoric, and I agree, it's important to think about the sort of cultural decay and the decay of social capital, but that just talking about it's not going to do anything. Nobody in rural Virginia is going to listen to that and think, yeah, that's right, we need to have a resurgence of social capital here.
Right. So then that leads to a kind of nihilistic approach that you see from some on the libertarian right, like the Kevin Williamsons, that are just like, let's expedite the complete destruction of these communities. Just get everybody who has a modicum of talent needs to be encouraged to move the fuck out, and that will be our solution, because these places are never going to thrive. They're inefficient in a modern post-industrial economy. And if we were populating the United States ex nihilo, they would never exist. There's no point for them.
I guess like the less gonzo
I like the gonzo
argument would be, yeah, like, look, it's inefficient. It's inefficient to have this kind of population sprawl.
Right.
And we want people with intellectual talents to move out of those places and to contribute where their intellectual capital will be maximized in these other big cities or whatever.
Right.
I mean, I think the problem is, even if we focused on achieving that end, there's a very painful transition period during which real humans suffer. And like, you know, it's the problem with the sort of abstract free market arguments about creative destruction. Like, oh yeah, well, fuck GM, it couldn't compete, we should just let it go under.
Right.
Okay, meanwhile, you're talking about thousands upon thousands of real humans who will lose their job and who are at an age where developing new skills is difficult and humiliating. And so like, it's the real human cost isn't considered in the equation.
Right. And yeah, right. Because GM goes, people suffer, your community loses its tax base. You can't provide goods and services to the residents who need them more than ever. And then that actually even makes the federal programs less effective, because if you have, like, say, grants where the government gives you a grant, but the local government matches that, the local government can't even match the federal grant. So it creates a lot of carnage, and humans are not widgets. They don't just, optimize their income and think, oh, I should move 500 miles across the country.
Some conservative should write a book called American Carnage. Speaking of carnage.
Yeah. Some conservative who writes at Politico is leaving Politico.
Alberta is?
Yeah. That was his last, the Nikki Haley article was the last piece for Politico.
What was Tim Carney's book called? Because he's a he's a political thinker.
Is it Alienated America?
Yeah, so he thinks about a lot of these things, and he does like the church stuff. And
right. So
I do think, before you say anything on that, I do think that the fact that you have serious conservative intellectuals really thinking about these problems and talking openly about the fact that probably the sort of libertarian Reagan paradigm was in some sense a failure, or has been a failure for these people, is a good thing. It means you will get people thinking about interesting and creative solutions.
Yes. I agree with that. I think it's good that paradigm is losing its hold. What concerns me is that the replacement appears to be a lot of culture warring and hyper partisanship.
Thus far, yes.
Instead of creative, pragmatic problem solving.
Yes, agreed. Like, if you had more people doing what Romney's plan does for childhood poverty with these things and talking about it more in the Senate or in the House or in interviews or in essays they could write about at the National Review, etc., it would be great to see that. But you just really haven't seen that much in the Republican Party. Because again, I think they're just behind. They haven't quite figured it out.
Right. And I fear that, like, this bias toward incrementalism, which I would usually share, this kind of pragmatic institutionalism, promoting incremental solutions, that right now, in the next 5 to 10 years, we might have to think about restructuring some institutions in a quite major way, right? That would be not a priori like conservative, right? That just might happen because
that wouldn't be incremental in the sense, like, because the conservative, I think the argument would be, the greater the failure, the more willing one should be to experiment. And right now, clearly there's a pretty big failure on a
Right.
lot of these issues. Like you really have a group of people whose lives have gotten significantly worse across the past 10, 15 years.
Right. And I think that justifies going big
Yes.
with the experimentation and accepting the fact that there are going to be unintended consequences.
Right.
And sometimes you're going to get the policy making wrong and fuck up.
I
And we
agree.
should be okay with that, because otherwise, what happens is you just get more like, let's try this kind of small policy idea. Maybe it helps a few people on the margins. Meanwhile, the culture war becomes more and more
Right. And
intense.
furthermore, the kind of experimentation that you get is more of a nihilistic experimentation, because people become more willing when their lives get worse to gamble, right? So a lot of people who voted for Trump, for example, were just like, burn the fucker down. They were
Right,
willing
right.
to gamble with Trump. So you have to take that willingness to gamble, but move it into a responsible direction and take some real gambles that could be costly in terms of policy outcomes. And then you try to adjust them.
Right.
But better than these rhetorical, burn the whole system down gambles.
Right. And this is a case where you can take advantage of federalism, right? Because you can have
Yes.
experimentation where you go big and bold, but okay, well, let's try these policies out in West Virginia. Let's try those policies out in Kentucky or
Right.
South Dakota and see what is actually effective, what works, and push more of that, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, I agree. And so hopefully, I agree with you. The Reagan paradigm is losing its hold. There are a lot of people who are starting to think about this kind of bold experimentation. Let's hope that we have more of that and less culture war nonsense in the future.
Culture war that's necessary, I'm perfectly happy with. So I think there is a need for certain kinds of culture war, and we need to do something about the hold that radical
Absolutely.
progressivism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But if your culture war is let's build a 300-foot border wall in drone Silicon Valley, right? That's probably not going to be salubrious.
Well, with the border wall, I'm okay with that. I mean, I
Well,
think,
I was being facetious,
yeah,
but my point is, if the culture war is more, how can we hurt the other side, then how
correct.
can we help these people? I think that's a
Or
problem.
how can we reasonably and responsibly push back against some of this bullshit, which, by the way, I think is one of the things, for however flawed the 1776 project was, it was at least like a more earnest way of pushing back against some of the bullshit. And so I'm happy with things like that. And if it has to come from the top down at this point, I think that that's fine, because it just has to. Because what we're looking at is a situation in which the institutions themselves are more of a threat than the government could be. That is to, so this is why I think like the sort of libertarian response is a problem, because the government can actually be used for more cultural good here than institutions that have been largely captured by radical progressivism. That's a whole different conversation anyway. So that's not really going to help West Virginia too much. But yeah, maybe we can focus on that. I saw, just as a interesting look into this, the Ezra Klein article on the problem with California that caused some interesting debate. And basically, Klein's a progressive. California is run completely by, it's a monoparty state, essentially Democrat. Right. And yet they have failure after failure of things that you would think progressives would want. And Klein's argument sort of, they're operationally conservative, right? The problem is they behave like conservatives, right? And of course, conservatives were like, whoa, wait the fuck a second.
Right.
No, the problem is they don't listen to the concerns that conservatives raise about all of these kinds of policies and regulatory capture, etc. Anyway, it was an interesting debate.
Yeah. And I think the problem with California is you created a state that functions really, really well for hyper educated, high IQ liberals,
Yes.
but doesn't function that well for anyone else.
It's also, by the way, a warning about massive increasing inequality with immigration.
Or
I mean,
increasing inequality, period.
well, sure, but I think a lot of that, if you look at it, is enabled by mass amounts of low-skilled immigration.
Right.
But
right.
anyway, those are different topics. We can talk about those another
Right.
time.
But I think both of us would agree then that one of the key solutions or things that would help this problem that perhaps isn't as appreciated by people who don't take IQ and personality traits seriously is you can't solve these problems without attracting high IQ conscientious people to these regions of the United States.
You need intellectual capital. Some intellectual capital, it's like athletic capital, if you will, right? Some
Right.
of it's innate and some of it's based on the skills that you impart upon a population. So
Right.
you're not, I mean, you could have the greatest education system of the world, and if you're putting people with IQs of 80 into it, it's not going to matter. And yes,
Right.
you do need that. And I think also you need to this is why you just need to take these traits seriously and talk about them seriously.
Right. Right. And I think if you can create like a locally minded civic elite, that
Yes.
it provides a huge benefit because locally minded elite who pour money and resources back into local
Right.
communities tend to be looked upon favorably, right? Like if you so say the store Meyer, which the first Meyer was in Greenville, Michigan, people in Greenville, who even those who are quite populist and Trumpy, have very positive attitudes toward the Meyer family because
Right.
it benefited people locally. It's a local good.
That gets to the like more localism would probably be a little bit better. I think the move toward cosmopolitan globalism, although understandable, and obviously you need some globalism, it's inevitable. A philosophy of localism would probably be a healthy philosophy to get people to think about that. And yeah, people who think, you know what, maybe I could make a little bit more in New York, or I could be around this star or that star, but damn it, I grew up here, or I developed a fondness for the landscape here. I like the people. I'm going to invest here. I'm going to focus here. And after 40 years or 50 years, this is going to bear fruit.
Yes. So apparently we're just going to go back to It's a Wonderful Life, right?
Norman Rockwell.
Yeah, the
All going back
talented
to Norman Rockwell.
George Bailey. The greatest thing that ever happened was this talented guy got forced to
Right.
to stay in his local community.
Well, but it is true that's the localist narrative is designed precisely to make people feel a bond with their community that dissuades them from taking perhaps better opportunities elsewhere.
That's right. That's why I honestly think that It's a Wonderful Life is the best conservative movie ever made.
It's one of the better. I will agree with that.
All right. So that will conclude our discussion, and we'll be back next week.